Good morning, everybody. Welcome to all our young audiences that are here today. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about protecting what's precious. With that, we're talking a little bit about the world's sixth great extinction. Does anyone know what that is? Perfect. So we'll unpack a little bit about what world's sixth great extinction is. With that comes thousands of species being eliminated from their homes and having their habitats feeling compromised and unlivable. To have this conversation and help me to have this conversation with each of you today, I'm joined by two great panelists, Drew Gardner, Director of Biodiversity for Emirates Nature Wildlife, and Nicholas Hurd, who's Acting Director General of Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund. So rather than me explain what conservation funds are and what these gentlemen do, if you can just spend a little bit of time explaining your world and what you do within your jobs. Maybe you can start with yourself.
Hi, yeah, good to see so many people here. It's great, and so many young people as well, which is really important. My name's Drew Gardner. I work with Emirates Nature, which is an environmental organization which has been working in the UAE for about the last 23 years. And we have a whole range of different kind of projects that we do, from restoring mangroves to working in marine habitats to working in the mountains. We plant trees, we do surveys on biodiversity, we are working with finance for nature and so on. So we do a lot of things. My role in the organization is really as a scientist looking at biodiversity issues, which means the native animals and plants. We try to find out where they live, and we also particularly try to involve the communities, both the communities in those areas and broader through the UAE, the volunteers that we have who sign up and come out to nature to appreciate it. So, for example, one of the things that we do is something called Nature at Night. We live here in the UAE in a desert country, basically. And that means that many of the animals are nocturnal, meaning that they are active at night. So when you go to the desert in the daytime, very often you don't actually see very much kind of animal life. But if you go at night, you see a lot more. And so we have a program where we take people out at night, usually a group of maybe 15 people or something, and show them that the desert is not a sort of a dead, empty environment. It's a living ecosystem with all sorts of animals, from little gerbils hopping around, bats flying overhead, scorpions, snakes, geckos, lots of beetles, all living together in this rather extreme environment.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Nicholas, maybe you can talk a little bit about you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Mubadala as well for introducing this very, very important topic. Welcome to all of you. I'm delighted that you can be here. The protection of nature is very, very important indeed, increasingly important, and with the connection here with climate change at COP, I'm so happy that Mubadala have invited the two of us and have raised the topic. So my name is Nicholas Hurd. I work for the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund. We're based in Abu Dhabi. We started about 14 years ago, and we provide small amounts of money to people all around the world to help protect endangered animals, plants, and fungi. So we provide small amounts of money to the people who are really dedicated, who really care, who are really passionate about trying to stop extinction of the animals that they care about, the animals maybe in their area, in their local region. So whilst Drew and Emirates Nature very much focus on the UAE, we are from Abu Dhabi external. So it's support that goes to species and in countries and habitats and people who maybe have no direct connection to the UAE, but which I think reflect the interest of the UAE in globally helping to reduce the problem that we face from biodiversity loss, the crisis of biodiversity that we're facing. So it's support from the UAE internationally. We try to help people who go out into the field, who work in nature. We try to support people to help keep that connection between us as humans and nature, and to try to stop the extinction of those really, really endangered animals and plants all around the world. There are so many people who just need a little bit of support, a little bit of financial help, who can go and do amazing things. And that's where we try to help them out to enable with that.
So because we've got a lot of young audience in the room, maybe you can just explain that a little bit further. What does conservation funds actually do? Like, explain that to everyone.
So the type of money that we provide does all kinds of things. So many of you will have heard of, for example, poaching of rhinoceroses, where people kill the rhinoceros to take their horns, or elephants, where people will shoot elephants in Africa to take their tusks. So often conservation is to try to prevent people poaching, illegally hunting animals such as elephants, but in fact any animals which are illegally hunted. So often it's to help people protecting those animals in protected areas around the world. Often it's to do research work. So, for example, if a frog is not very well known, to go and find out how many of that frog approximately do still exist in a certain area. Maybe someone knew 20 years ago, but hasn't been to find out since. Often it's to work with local people, with local communities, very important, because it's those people who live in these areas where all these endangered species live, in these highly important areas. It's up to them as well to protect their local environment, their local habitat. So it's very important to work with local communities to encourage them to protect their areas where they live, the species and endangered animals and plants that live there, and also to have the opportunity to grow their own development at the same time and to balance those out.
So I'm going to come back to that, but maybe, Drew, if you can talk to us a little bit about, both of you mentioned we're at this great extinction, sixth great extinction. What is that?
Yes, thanks, Mary. Yeah, it's often said that we're now in the midst of a sixth mass extinction event, which means there's been 5 other ones previous. Now, by a mass extinction event, we mean a time when, in a relatively short period of geological time, a large proportion of the animals, plants, microorganisms, whatever, on the Earth became extinct. Now, geological time is, in a sense, unimaginably long to us as humans. So what's a blink of an eye in geological time could actually be centuries or even thousands of years. The mass extinction event, which most people know about, is one which occurred 65 million years ago. Can anyone tell me what became extinct in that mass extinction 65 million years ago?
Brilliant. Go ahead.
Dinosaurs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well done. Yeah, the dinosaurs. This is the one that everybody loves and knows about, dinosaurs. And 65 million years ago, they became extinct. The dinosaurs had lived on the Earth for hundreds of millions of years, and then suddenly, they're no more. And in the fossil record, you don't find any more dinosaurs really in the fossil record after that. But at the same time that the dinosaurs went extinct, a lot of different animals and plants also became extinct. So in the rocks here in the UAE, you find fossils of things called rudists, which are a kind of seashell, if you like. They also, at that same time, became extinct. So something happened then which caused all of these species to become extinct. And I'm sure most of you probably know this, but we now think it was due to an asteroid colliding with the Earth in a huge explosion, which changed the conditions on the Earth so much that so many species became extinct. So that was 65 million years ago, long before people lived on the Earth. But now, that was the 5th mass extinction. There were other ones we can see in the fossil record before that. But now we're talking about a 6th one. And if you had asked me 20 years ago why because even then we thought we were in a mass extinction event, why we thought of this, I would have listed a whole range of factors. including deforestation, the loss of forests, the loss of habitats, pollution, overhunting, the movement of invasive species from one area to another, and all of these factors which were basically causing species to become extinct. It's actually very difficult to calculate the rate of extinction, partly because we don't know how many species there are on Earth even now. The estimates for how many species we have here sort of range from 8 million up to 50 million. We really don't know. So it's very difficult to calculate, how fast species are becoming extinct. But scientists really firmly believe that the evidence shows that the rate of species extinction now is probably 1,000 or maybe even 10,000 times faster than you would expect in normal geological time. So species are becoming extinct very, very quickly. Can anyone tell me the name of a species which has become extinct? Meaning that it's no longer any of them left on Earth. What is becoming? The grey rhino, but Nick can probably answer this better than me. Has there been an extinction of a rhino species completely recently?
Well, the northern white rhino is possibly about to go extinct. There are 2 individuals left. There's no breeding. So that's somewhat inevitable. Not quite yet, but within the next year or 2, probably. And sorry, I think there's an answer here as well.
The mammoths, certainly mammoths were a kind of elephant, which the last mammoth, I think, probably came extinct 40,000, maybe 20,000, I don't know, something 20,000 years ago, something like that. And in more recent times, one that everybody knows about is the dodo, which is a strange giant pigeon which lived on Mauritius. These other ones are things like the Tasmanian tiger or the passenger pigeon. These are species which became extinct really since we had things like the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, since we had photography. We've got photographs of these animals living in zoos, and now they're gone. So we know quite a lot of species have become extinct, and we can see these. So I said 20 years ago I'd have listed all those kind of causes of extinction, but now we know that there is another one which is really overarching, and that is climate change. It's something which we have really become more and more aware of, and now we realize that climate change is a really important factor which is driving many species to extinction. Climate change because it may destroy habitats, or the climate may become too extreme for some species to live. Every species basically has a set of conditions in which it can live, and if the climate or something goes outside those conditions, then that species has a real problem. So we now know climate change, and that's why we're all at COP, basically, to try to find ways to limit the amount of warming of the planet.
Maybe before we come on to that, in terms of what we're doing here, is it just something that we're seeing in the region here, like extinction in terms of the rapid extinction is happening mostly in the desert area, or actually you're seeing the same thing globally as well?
It certainly is a global problem, yes, absolutely. And there, as Andrew mentioned, there are many, many different factors, but climate change is an overarching factor and is possibly most extreme impact in some of the tropical areas where a lot of species have evolved with very narrow survival limits, let's say, because they've so many species and they each have their own tiny little speciality, their tiny little niche. So as soon as their surroundings, their habitat moves away from that, they are no longer able to exist. And so, for example, frogs, which have evolved in very particular mountaintops, let's say, if the temperature increases or the climate changes out of what they've evolved to, then often they can't move anywhere. And this is a very, very similar problem with all sorts of species. Coral is one that is possibly best known. As the sea temperatures get higher, corals can no longer survive, and so they die in bleaching incidents that we see all around the world. But I would say that also climate change is not just a matter of increased temperature, but often it brings increased risk from disease. So one of the main threats to frogs and salamanders, amphibian species around the world, is a disease. And this is the risk to frogs of dying from this disease has probably been increased because of climate change. So it's direct and indirect. Climate change also removes a lot of the habitat for species, a lot of the forest, for example, or it dries wetlands as areas get hotter. And so species which have evolved in certain wetlands are not always able to move somewhere else. Species in the sea can maybe move from one area to another.
Break that down
Others
for
can't.
me. Break that down for me. Like, why can't they move? Isn't that the natural thing when an environment doesn't feel right? It's normal for species to move from one place to the other. What's preventing that move?
Well, often species have evolved in very particular locations around the world. And so you, particularly with smaller species, you find that maybe they only exist in one pond or one lake, for example. And so it's very hard for them to move from one lake across dry land, maybe 100 kilometers, to another lake. A fish, for example, can't do that. A frog probably can't do that either. So it's particularly a problem with species which are really endemic, point endemic is the word, to a given location. Often they're just not able to move. They can't do it. And so if that habitat changes, the temperature or other factors change because of climate change, then that is a very, very real existential risk to that species.
So we started talking about COP and what it's trying to do here today, right? So a lot of reasons people are here today is to talk about action and next steps. What do we do beyond? So we'll come back to COP, but beyond COP, what can we do in terms of trying to preserve, slow down the effect that's happening? What are the recommendations?
Okay, so one thing that Nick is talking about is how animals maybe with climate change can't move from one area to another or one pond to another or whatever. But what we know also is that really in areas all over the world, as humans, we have basically fragmented the habitat. So where in areas where there might have been a continuous forest, that forest may have been broken up into smaller sections. Here in the Emirates, we have the mountains. The mountains have now been broken into small sections by highways cutting across them and pipelines and power lines and so on, which may actually form barriers that species can't get across. So one of the ways that we need to really kind of think about this is to try to build in corridors where species can move from one area to another and try to limit the amount of habitat fragmentation which is going on. So that's a really important area. I think in terms of COP, though, one of the really important things which is happening here in Dubai at the moment is the understanding that agriculture and food systems, how we grow our food, is having a really critical effect on nature and on species and driving extinction. So for example, it's estimated that somewhere between 80 or 90% of deforestation, the cutting down of the forest, is due to agriculture. In the Amazon, for example, where areas of the Amazon forest are being cleared, it's usually because people are clearing it so they can either have cattle or raise crops which are used to feed cattle. And so one thing that's really important at this COP is the signing of the Emirates Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems, which I think roughly 140 countries have now signed up to. And that is a declaration where the countries are signing up to say that they're going to work to make agriculture more sustainable Unfortunately, it's not a binding agreement, but it's a really good start. And I think things like that are really, really important.
But you do more than that, right? So COP is starting those conversations, but you do a lot more in terms of working with organizations, in terms of getting children in schools potentially to volunteer, corporations to support. Maybe talk a little bit about how everybody can get involved.
Absolutely. I think it's really important that people get involved, because when people are involved with nature and realize that nature is in trouble and there are things that they can do, that understanding through the communities is really vital if we're going to actually solve some of these problems. So at Emirates Nature, we're looking at what are known as nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions means working with nature to try to encourage the conservation of nature in a way that actually benefits local communities and people. So, for example, everyone's heard of mangroves here, and everyone's talking about mangroves. And one of the great things that mangroves can do is to take carbon dioxide out of the air and store it in the mud under the mangroves. This is, recognized, and this is the UAE is really planning on restoring mangroves as much as possible. But what we at Emirates Nature, we've been doing research into this, and what we have kind of realized is that it's not just the mangroves in the seascapes, in the marine ecosystems, but other habitats are equally important. So seagrass beds and salt marsh habitats, for example, also store carbon. And we have shown that actually having a mosaic of these habitats, so have mangroves next to seagrass, next to salt marsh, actually allows more carbon capture than one of these kind of habitats on their own. So we are looking at this. We are working with people to plant mangroves, for example, in areas that we're selecting very, very carefully so that these mangroves are going to be as successful as possible. So that's what we're doing, things like that. We're also in the mountains working to try to use native species, and one particular native species is something called the Arabian moringa. This is a local tree which grows in the mountains here, which is actually sometimes called a miracle tree. It has so many potential benefits. The trees produce seeds which have an oil which is a very healthy oil for cooking and for salads. It's also a perfect oil for making high quality soaps and shampoos and face creams and things like that. But the tree also has leaves which are full of antioxidants and are very healthy to eat. It produces a tuber under the ground which you can also eat and use as a food substance. And the trees produce flowers which the bees love, and the bees can make a very special honey from. And it's a native tree, it supports the local biodiversity here as well.
So the building of the ecosystem altogether.
Exactly. So by planting these trees in mountain areas, and also planting the other native trees, such as the cedar tree and the samur tree and gaff trees, is a fantastic way of actually supporting biodiversity. But all of these trees are also super important for honey production, and local honey production is very valuable to the local communities as well. So trying to work with nature to benefit the communities is something that we see as really beneficial.
Thank you for that. Nick, your reaction? Same solutions? I think not.
Well, no. I think thank you, Drew. I think also just to go back to the beginning of what you mentioned, I think absolutely the importance of corridors and protecting areas and allowing species as much as possible to migrate and move and for populations of species to connect is absolutely crucial. I think adding maybe on to also what you asked Drew about, yes, what can we do?
Because your challenges are a bit different, I'm assuming, sorry.
Yes, it is, yes. Yeah.
So maybe if you can talk a little bit about your challenges and what we could do in order to support.
Well, I think some of the challenges that we face are how can we support species to really maintain the richness of an ecosystem. And I think that what you've touched on with the trees here, Drew, is crucially important, because often plants are the basis of an ecosystem. Often they're overlooked when it comes to conservation, because often, particularly when it comes to the climate element, but conservation often is, right, let's plant trees, without maybe necessarily full consideration of how those trees interact, either within an ecosystem or how those trees can be sustainable. So trees and plants need pollinators, the bees, which Drew mentioned, but also all sorts of other insects pollinate other species. It's not just the bees. A lot of plants and trees are not pollinated by insects at all. Often they're by bats in Central America, for example. And so I think often we lose sight of the holistic need for conservation, and to really support the conservation ecosystems and all the species that are integral to that. So, for example, in central Mexico, the trees that rely on bats for pollination are not going to survive very long if there are no bats. There will be a generation of trees. And I think often, even when we think about regeneration and replanting, we have to remember, how are these plants and trees going to survive more than just one generation? In order to be genuinely sustainable, and this ties in with carbon sequestration as well, how can those trees that are planted, can we be sure that they were there in 50 years' time or longer? We have to make sure that the animals associated with that ecosystem are also there, are protected. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago about the proportion of biomass in trees in the Amazon. So the largest trees in the Amazon, how do they survive? How do they regenerate in future for the future? They need the largest monkeys, the howler monkeys, in order to eat their fruit, disperse the fruit, and have new trees growing. If those howler monkeys are not there, then the trees will not be there in the future. Once they die, there'll be no regeneration. And so that's just one example of how we need the animals to support the plants, to support carbon sequestration. We need an entirely rich ecosystem and biodiversity.
But I guess as we think about the audience that we have, creating that ecosystem, volunteering is one, other things that you depend on in order to help you create that, because there's only so much that you can do on your own as a conservative fund. What is it you need from an audience, from the rest of the policymakers or schools or governments in terms of trying to help you preserve that ecosystem?
I think often governance is something which is very important. So I was talking earlier on about the importance of local communities in protecting habitat. So governance is very, very important. Who owns, who runs, who controls on a day-to-day level these areas which are being protected for biodiversity? Who is it who says, no, we don't want those trees to be chopped down. No, we don't want those that river to be dammed. Yes, often it is central government, but more often than not, particularly in developing countries and biodiverse rich countries, it's the local communities who I feel need to be empowered to be able to make those decisions. It's their home. They need to be able to do that. I think on an individual level for us here, let's say in Dubai, I think there are a lot of choices we can make in terms of consumption, for example. You know, be it buying coffee or chocolate. You know, we can make the choice in the supermarket. Do we buy the chocolate which has the sticker on it, or the symbol, this logo to say, right, this chocolate is say carbon friendly or rainforest friendly, or and so on. You know, we have the choice to say, well, this chocolate, okay, it has the stamp to say it is being produced in a way which is friendly to the environment. So I think there are day-to-day decisions that we make where we can make even little, just incremental changes, And that, I think, for us who are not living in biodiverse habitats, in ecosystems, in the forest, choices that we can make from an urban perspective as well.
You were going to say something?
No, I think that's really important, and that's one of our roles at Emirates Nature WWF, is to kind of encourage that. So we have a program called the Leaders of Change, which people can join and sign up to, and that has various different ways of working. But we have there's an educational aspect where we basically give talks and short courses and so on, so people can understand more about how they can personally be involved in in conserving things, what sort of choices that they can make. And once people understand and have a better education, really, if you like, of environmental education, understand these things, and they can tell their families and their workmates and so on as well. So it can be quite transformational and spread through the community, and that's what we are really trying to do. So give people the opportunity to actually see for themselves in nature, to learn about ways that they can actually they can make these kind of choices and benefit their community, and to the benefit of the whole conservation scene.
So maybe if I can take you back, you talked a little bit about the importance of conversations during COP, right? You talked about actions that happened during COP. How involved have you been, and what do you feel has maybe impacts that you've walked away with in terms of solutions from COP, and then what we can carry over after COP that we can be considering as a community? Either of you.
Yeah, that's a bit of a difficult question.
Okay.
I think personally, I think I'm speaking at maybe 5 panels at COP, like this, over different kind of subjects, from crop diversity to bees, to species conservation, and so on, to nature-based solutions. And so I think for me, it kind of focuses your mind really on getting this information across. And I think, obviously, there's so many organizations kind of also discussing these kind of issues. It's actually quite encouraging, in a sense, to realize, that so many private companies, government organizations, the negotiation teams and so on are all working really to try to move forward. So I feel quite encouraged by that, I must say.
Nick?
Yeah, I think, as you say, Drew, it's a tricky question. And this might be reflecting also just the people I've been interacting with and where I've been, but I've been really encouraged, actually, in the last few days of COP, of how nature has taken quite a prominent role. So, Drew, you touched on that earlier on, relating to agriculture and food production. We, as humans, rely on nature for food production and agriculture. Yes, much of it is very mechanized, much of it is become quite industrialized, but again, we rely on bees, for example, and I forget the proportion here, but a very large proportion of our fruit and vegetable pollination. Our food production is not separate from nature, even in very industrialized economies. And I think for me, it's very encouraging that these topics have been raised and are so prominent at this COP. Nature, from a conservation and protection perspective, has also gained a lot of prominence and attention at this COP. I think increasingly over the last couple of COPs, gradually more and more so. And that, I think, is also very encouraging. I think we often think of climate change outside the natural sphere as being a sort of an engineering problem. Okay, how do we either remove carbon from the atmosphere through solutions such as carbon capture and storage, which some people would argue is more or maybe not much of a solution, and we talk a lot about clean energy. And that is obviously very important. We all need energy. Our society needs energy more and more so. But I think what is becoming more prominent at this COP, and I find very encouraging, is a reminder that we already have probably the best way of sequestering carbon, the best technology for sequestering carbon is nature. And as long as we can help to protect nature, help to restore nature, we have a fabulous solution which will help us to really reduce the carbon in the atmosphere and bring us that bit closer to this golden number of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the fact that that is being talked about more, is being understood more as a solution, I'm very encouraged by. In addition to just our moral obligation, I think, to protect nature and biodiversity, but the fact that it also is being recognized as a solution is very encouraging to me.
Well, that's the reason why we're having these conversations, right? Like, so a lot of the times you'll hear people saying, well, why are we at COP and why are we having these conversations, and do they have an output? Are they successful or not? Part of the reason, I think that's the awareness that we're trying to build here today, is to make sure that we are talking about things, raising awareness. We're talking about them more frequently than we have done maybe in the previous COPs, in order for people to build a better understanding and know what actions to take. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand when we talk about like success of COP. Was it successful or not? These are the things that maybe attribute. Would you say that's correct in terms of, yeah, we were able to raise awareness and maybe help people feel like they can understand a little bit more about what they can do? Yeah? Okay, so, sorry, before I...
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think often people can really get involved in things when they have some sort of personal experience themselves. So I think that's why it's so important to try to encourage people to get out into nature and experience the animals, the plants, the peace and quiet and so on that you get when you go out into the nature. Into the desert here, it is a fantastic experience. And I think that really personal involvement is really, really critical.
So if you're not a school student, are there ways that the average student can get involved beyond what schools are offering?
There are. There are a lot of organizations here, even in the Emirates, which are involved in nature and taking people out into the environment and kind of teaching them. At Emirates Nature, that is basically our main thing really that we do, is trying to really get people out, whether it's the youth, anybody really, out into nature to experience for themselves and learn about it so that they can then spread this information through their family. Okay. And I think it's really important. Sorry.
No, I fully agree, and I think it's fabulous what Emirates Nature is doing. I think it's really important, and I completely agree with Drew that maintaining that connection with nature is crucial to protection. So there's a term, and I can't remember, maybe Drew remembers better than I do, biophilia, which is, which really refers to our innate connection with the natural world and with our planet. And it's something that, maybe living in an urban environment, we tend to forget a little bit, or we don't, maybe it sort of is buried a little bit. But I think that if, for example, children are taken out by Emirates Nature to go out into the desert or to the sea or the coastlines, that's the kind of moment where, adults and children are kind of reminded about this innate connection that we have with nature, this kind of bond that we almost, is naturally built into us as part of nature, as we are ourselves. And I think that's where what Emirates Nature does with that is crucially important in a very urban environment that we do have here in the UAE. And so I think it's a very, very worthwhile effort and undertaking.
The reason why we're having this conversation is we're trying to figure out how to protect what's precious, right? So optimistic, we can't stop global warming, we can't stop the things, but we can slow it down, hopefully, right? Optimistic about how we do that. Do you feel encouraged based on all the conversations, or do you feel like the challenges, actually we've got a lot more work to do?
We've definitely got a lot more work to do. Personally, I feel quite reasonably optimistic about things. If we look at the UAE, for example, we know there have been at least local extinctions here. And some of the animals we've lost in the UAE are things like the Arabian leopard, the wolf, the hyena, which are no longer here, sadly. But we have a tremendous number of species still living here in the UAE, probably more than many people kind of realize. For example, we have 3 species of foxes. We have the caracal, which is a large cat. We have the sand cat. We have the Gordon's wild cat. There are lots of species of bats, lots of species of desert rodents. And these are just some of the mammals, of course. If we go to the reptiles, you know, we have something like 60 species of terrestrial reptiles living in the UAE. Very diverse fauna. And, you know, most of these species, you know, should be able to survive here, given a little bit of help from the setting up of protected areas, corridors, as we talked about before. And, you know, when people realize this and kind of know and can actually experience some of these animals themselves, this makes a difference. And I think I'm optimistic that we're working towards that, and we realize what the various problems are and ways how we can actually solve these.
I would agree. I'm cautiously optimistic, I think, by which I mean from a nature perspective. I don't think I'm in a position to talk about the sort of some of the more technical elements of COP. But I think that as long as we prevent species from going extinct, and as long as we're able to either preserve or restore relevant and appropriate habitat, I think that nature has an incredible resilience, an amazing way of bouncing back. So extinction is permanent. That's why we want to avoid it. So yes, as soon as a species is extinct, that's it, that's curtains, it's done. If we can prevent a species from going extinct, if we can make sure that it has somewhere to live, habitat protected, suitable, appropriate habitat, then that species will thrive. What we want to try to do is to make sure that the collection of species in an ecosystem, rich biodiversity, survive together. That is something which is very, very crucial. All too often, we don't really know how different species interact with each other. And that's why we have to make sure that, preferably, none of them within an ecosystem go extinct, because you don't really know when you're pulling the plug. You don't know when you're pulling out the stone that holds the whole system together. And often it is the small species that are overlooked, that are maybe not quite so charismatic, potentially. And so I think that's why it's very important that we protect all species. And I think if we can do that, if we can prevent as much of this extinction as possible that Andrew was talking about earlier on, and protect the habitat, then yes, then I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that nature will rebound and will regenerate, often just by being left alone.
Thank you for that. We're out of time. I think we've all got our key takeaways in terms of what we need to do as next steps. Be outdoor more, be out in the nature. Data is important. We've heard a lot of that throughout the last couple of days, but the importance of data allows us to understand our ecosystems better. Big or small, all impact the ecosystem, and therefore it's our roles in terms of trying to preserve that as much as possible. So all of us have a part in that situation. So thank you. Thank you very much. A big hand of applause, please, everybody. Thank you.